Right, Kevin Boyd and Dr. Gamiak will be on shortly up on the screen. And I think we have some questions from the virtual attendees. So we just traveled through COVID as a family and ran OAT 2 weeks after. Vitamin C was tragically low. What would you recommend to do at this point, assuming antioxidant defenses are extremely low?
Yeah, several grams of vitamin C per day, really up to bowel tolerance for at least a month. And I would also go for the CBD and curcumin just to start quenching all that inflammation. And then the C is the simplest free radical control.
Okay, if anybody else has a question, please.
I have a comment to Dr. Paul's presentation. So I followed your work for a number of years, but I think the peroxynitrite postulate is flawed, and I'll make a couple comments, then welcome your comments. So we can't forget there's 3 isoforms of NOS. And so when NO reacts with superoxide, it can form peroxynitrite, OONO minus, but to stabilize that negative charge, it's going to simply rearrange to form inorganic nitrate, which is stable. And it's self-correcting because if you recouple, so the 3 main sources of superoxide are an uncoupled NOS, uncoupled mitochondrial electron transport chain, and NADPH oxidase. If you recouple NOS, nitric oxide suppresses NADPH oxidase, recouples the electron transport chain, so you don't get any superoxide production. So that's the first comment. And the second one, under those conditions where it could happen, where you have equal flux of superoxide and nitric oxide, is only under inflammation. So when the inducible nitric oxide synthase enzyme is upregulated and active. And that particular enzyme is calcium independent. So your calcium influx is not affecting the peroxynitrite production pathway, and even if it was, it would just simply rearrange to form inorganic nitrate.
Okay, so the problem is that we get superoxide from, in terms of the calcium effects, we get superoxide both from 2 of the calcium-stimulated NADPH oxidases. We also get superoxide from increased production in the mitochondrial electron transport chain. Both of them are triggered by calcium. So it's simply not the case that we're not getting superoxide. And I think that the other thing which is important, and these are, you get various feedback loops at different points, but one of the things that's also important here is once you get peroxynitrite produced, then that oxidizes the tetrahydrobiopterin to dihydrobiopterin, which then leads to partial uncoupling of all the nitric oxide synthases, so they start producing superoxide as well. So I would not agree with what your position is.
Well, no, I think you just did, because in order for peroxynitrite to be produced, you have to have pretty much equal flux of nitric oxide and superoxide. So if you're getting superoxide being produced through the calcium influx, you're not getting nitric oxide produced because the oxidation of BH4 and NOS uncoupling. So there's no nitric oxide in that area to then be produced to react with superoxide. I think that's the loss of regulation.
What do you mean in that area? They're all occurring in the same cells.
Yeah, but NO is spatially...
These are cells, when you look at the effects on the most sensitive cells, which includes the nervous system, you have tremendous activities of the BGCCs, and you can get tremendous amounts of calcium flowing in the cells, and you can get large amounts of both nitric oxide and superoxide produced. So I don't agree with your position.
Well, so in that case, then it's the NOS2, the inducible NOS isoform that's upregulated. And
No,
that
the
enzyme is
initial-
calcium independent.
The initial nitric oxide comes from the calcium-dependent enzymes. Now, it's true that you will get subsequently inos induction as soon as you get your inflammatory response.
And that's calcium independent.
That's correct.
Anybody else have a question? Guess we're all tired, huh?
I have a question for Dr. Paul. I had thought that you had said that NAD had a reparative mechanism on the damaged voltage-gated calcium channels. Is that true, or did I not get that correct?
I don't remember, I'm sorry.
I'm trying to remember where I got that idea. And I think maybe Mercola told me that you said that. And so I was thinking of NAD as protective against EMF. And you can see a number of ways it was, but I thought that there was a direct mechanism. Yeah, but you've not lectured about a direct mechanism.
Okay, I've got a question for Dr. Shade. At some point in your presentation, I think about halfway through, you made a comment about choline, and I think I picked up that you had some disagreement with, I guess, some practitioners who feel that maybe a patient might be getting a little too much, and so can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there was that debate about TMAO being, I guess, a cardiotoxin. And the guys who wrote that paper were also selling a test for TMAO, and it was, you could look at it and say, oh, all right, wow, that's interesting. And they said that choline is being transformed into TMAO in the GI and going into circulation, where it has a negative effect on the cardiovascular system. Yet the biggest source of choline is fish, and they were relating it to meat eating. And there's a bunch of guys, I don't know if they're out of the Netherlands, who wrote a contrary article to it and said that it's probably a microbiome effect. They were associating the TMAO with being formed by the microbiome and it being a problem. And this contrary response is just that the microbiome from excessive meat eating has the cardiotoxic effects, not the TMAO itself. So a lot of people are trying to get choline out of the diet, but choline is so essential for making phosphatidylcholine and for bile flow and such. And so I thought it was not a good idea to restrict choline.
Okay.
In general.
Well, because, my TMAO was elevated, and so my physician was bringing up, he said at least any supplements you're taking that have choline in it. And of course, I take a number of your supplements that do have some.
Phosphatidylcholine and all those. And I didn't agree with it, and I agreed with the other authors who were teaching against that.
Okay.
Could I add something to my comment about peroxynitrite, which I should have said before?
Sure.
When you're exposed to EMS, there is a rapid measured increase in peroxynitrite following that, and it's measured by measuring increases in three nitrotyrosine, which is thought to be a specific product of peroxynitrite. So that's been measured, and we know there are increases following EMF exposures.
And is that from decoupling of the nerve systems, or mitochondrial decoupling?
That doesn't tell you where it comes from, but there is evidence that the superoxide comes both from the mitochondria and from the NADPH oxidases, which I mentioned. And of course, the initial nitric oxide comes from the calcium-dependent enzymes.
Any other questions?
When you're doing the analysis of the public health data, can you also correlate with vaccination status? And so, for example, you know, like say you're looking at fluoride, we know there's a synergy between fluoride and aluminum, and you can get a lot of your aluminum from vaccines, a very unwise thing, but you know, there's a huge synergy with aluminum. You have all these synergies, so I think it's challenging to really get accurate conclusions because there are all these interactions between different toxins, and there is a real pronounced interaction between aluminum and fluoride as published in the journal Brain Research in 1998, where they found in the rats exposed to low-dose aluminum with fluoride dementia, Alzheimer's pathologies in the brains of those rats. So, you know, I guess that's a question for the Geyers, and I'll let you answer that. I may have another one. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
There's no reason to believe that one group has more aluminum in their vaccine than the other. That's it. The whole underlying assumption of these things is that you can take one thing out, and the others, if you have a big enough group, the others will cancel each other out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with my father. The concept of interaction obviously exists. It can be demonstrated in biological systems, but the size, the magnitude, if you have studies that are large enough, it should be equal in both groups. And it gets even more complicated because what would be the relationship? I mean, that's one of the problems that you run into is, 1 unit of aluminum equal to 1 unit of exposure to fluoride. I mean, they almost don't even translate. So it's really hard to consider all those things. The more you put in, basically, the less you get out because it becomes incomprehensible.
There's and I know you've delved deeply into autism, and everybody's interested in that autism. And years ago at one of these conferences, I learned about research on autistic children at a clinic in Tennessee, and they were 8 or 9-year-old autistics, and they were not doing well at getting rid of detoxifying their mercury and toxic metals. Research done by Tamara Marier, if you remember that. And she created a sanctuary free from EMFs like Wi-Fi, both in the clinic and the home. Maybe you've seen that one, Dr. Paul. And after 40 weeks, the child started pulling out of autism. He dumped enough mercury and other toxic metals, and then they rolled that out and did it with 20 more children and had similar results. Now you would think, and the author said, it looks to us like EMF exposure is at least one factor in the autism explosion that occurred in the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had the explosion in vaccine mandates, but we also had an explosion in the cell tower build-out, starting in major cities and then everywhere else, and we had an autism explosion. So I think there's talk about synergy. You got a synergy going on between EMF exposure and vaccine mania with vaccine mandates. God knows what we're in for what's going on now in the country. But just comment on that, please.
You may well be right, but the way we studied that is we took children the same vaccine, large numbers, with and without thimerosal. Everything else should be the same. There's no reason why they have more exposure to any of these other things. And there's a tremendous difference on that one variable. That's what you have to do in our type of work. Is you have to there's a zillion background things that affect things, but you want to make it so that the two groups are equivalent, except for one thing. And in this one, it was exquisite. It wasn't just another vaccine with thimerosal.
Right.
And this vaccine, maybe there's something else different about the vaccines. It was the same vaccine with and without thimerosal. Hard to explain
Mm-hmm. It's not working. Try.
You know, I think, as you can sort of see from the approach that I use, I mean, your comments are extremely well taken. And that we know there are interactions between the chemicals and the EMFs in terms of the way they act. And they occur at multiple levels. So there are effects on detoxification, and I talked a little bit about that in my talk. That the EMFs do inhibit detoxification of the chemicals. But there are also other interactions. So, for example, the chemicals act primarily through the NMDA receptors. The EMFs act primarily through the VGCCs, but the VGCCs act primarily presynaptically, and the chemicals act, and the NMDA receptors act primarily postsynaptically. So they may well act very much synergistically at the level of the individual synapses in the brain. And so there's all kinds of interactions here which are useful to know about and thinking about these things. I guess that's about what I wanted to say.
The way I think about things, the EMF is creating that neuroinflammatory activation and working very much to block that detoxification as it shifts you to the sympathetic, and you deprioritize detoxification, which is really a parasympathetic type of thing. And so, no matter what the first insult was that put them into that neuroinflammatory and excited state, they're then going to be net sinks for toxins, whether it was the toxins that activated them in the first place, or once they're in that neuroactivated state, they just start accumulating everything. And so when you shield them from all the EMF, it starts that come down of the system that allows the detoxification to start rebooting. I know when we did a lot of work with autism, I go to autism one every year. Once we added in CBD, all of a sudden we could go right into like full-on detox with these kids, whereas before you had to start with homeopathics and everything. So that activity of the CBD to block the neuroinflammatory cycle allowed them then to go into more normal detoxification routes. So, I mean, that's just the way I see it, that the EMF is just keeping it, hyper-agitated.
Another thing in this conference is the importance of sleep, and you leave your Wi-Fi on all night long. You've got somebody upstairs with their EMFs coming at you, and so on, and your pineal gland does not make the melatonin that it should be making, and so you lack a very important sleep hormone and a repair hormone. So I just think we have to be holistic in discussing things like detox, because there's all these different elements that come into play. And so I think we're all kind of in agreement on everything, but I just like to point out these other connections in, and the importance of sleep, which was very well handled in a number of presentations today. Oxygen, and so go ahead, comment on it. If you, go ahead.
I was going to comment on your sleep thing.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I think, okay, so it's clear that there's a sleep disruption, a major sleep disruption from EMFs. I think it occurs in all likelihood from two effects. One is the really massive lowering of melatonin. And the second one, it has to do with high levels of nocturnal norepinephrine. And the combination of those two can be extremely powerful. So, anyway, that's, but I don't know about that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well,
Okay, go ahead.
Just a question for Dr. Shade. You covered a lot of mechanistic material, and I appreciate that. A lot of esoteric stuff. I've heard you talk before on some of those things. Today, one simple takeaway for me was curcumin, and then I'm wondering if another one might be just B3. In other words, if you're not wanting to go esoteric on the expensive supplements and take 100 pills a day, is B3 enough to get you to the NAD type stuff that you were talking about today?
Well, B3 will get you there as long as your NAMPT is working. So it is the cheap way to get there. The younger you are, and if you're not chronically ill, you don't have chronic inflammation, then it should be able to get there. One of the interesting things about you picking both of those up is that curcumin, there's some evidence that curcumin helps reboot NAMPT. That's the enzyme that's taking the nicotinamide back up to NMN to become NAD. That's the part that gets blocked. And so if you do have, if you're older, you have some sort of inflammatory issue, then you have to come in with those more expensive NMN or NR, nicotinamide riboside. But yeah, niacin B3 is the cheaper, easier way to get there, and curcumin should support that enzyme that becomes a problem.
From Dr. Shade, you mentioned if someone gets COVID vaccination, they should start eating a lot of carb, or did I misunderstood?
Oh, no. When people are coming post-COVID, and a lot of these energy mechanisms have been turned down, like AMPK, it's harder to be on longer periods of fasting and carb restriction, and you tend to need to baby the body a little bit more. And so you'll eat more often and probably eat more carbs. And as the metabolism comes back up, you can shift to more of this AMPK activating diet with intermittent fasting and carb restrictions.
Question?
More of a comment that David was wondering where the mercury fillings are going, and that I think our recent analysis showed that we used about 50 million new mercury fillings last year, but it's primarily from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Veterans Administration, Indian Service, and Public Health Service. They exclusively use mercury still. So you may be able to separate veterans out from in your database and see if there's a difference.
The NHANES has detailed status about military, so yeah, that would be some way to look, see if that population really is there.
Oh, okay.
Let me just say one more thing about mercury, which I was doing the calculations. I think it's 100 trillion, 100 tons. From the data we have, you can actually calculate how many hundreds of tons of mercury are actually in Americans' mouth. Because once you know the filling and how much mercury, you can do some simple calculations. The amount was, I did it, I think it was over 100 tons of mercury just in the human bodies in the United States.
I'd like to first thank you guys for being here and sharing your great information. And I have, my usual off-the-wall question for y'all. If by some possible way that graphene was to enter into the human body, and do you have any information on the effect of EMF that might happen if a graphene molecule entered the human body and was excited that way?
That's an interesting question, and I've been asked that before. My I believe that graphene in the human body would actually lower EMF effects. So I think the concerns were misplaced there. And I can try to explain, if you wish, why I think that's true. You want me to do that?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so graphene is a I have to backtrack on that. There is evidence that some EMFs can actually inhibit the activation of the BGCCs that are produced by other EMFs. And I believe they do that basically by the interaction with the charges on the S4 helices being different, so that they can cause things to ratchet in instead of ratchet out. And graphene has the potential of doing that, where it basically reflects, because it's a planar molecule, it reflects the EMFs that you're using off of a different surface, so that it can then go in and impact the voltage sensor in a different way and interfere. So this is stuff I haven't talked about here at all, but my interpretation then is that I believe graphene would lower the effects of EMFs, not increase it.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I guess I would make a comment about the FDA's infinite wisdom about certain population not being able to have, or they wouldn't recommend we use amalgams. And are you familiar with, I guess it was last year? I guess it would be fun to lobby the FDA to include RA and asthma in the groups that we shouldn't put amalgam fillings in. Increase that list. In other words, they have expected mothers, and do you guys know about all the FDA stuff? Anyway, I think based on your research, wouldn't you consider that a thing we could maybe write the FDA about, or you could write the FDA if you're susceptible?
Obviously, as we do studies to link amalgam fillings with specific medical conditions, those become contraindications or certainly things you should be avoiding in the context of those diseases. A really interesting question for me is that since we found links with those, are there differences? Our experience with mercury and its effects on biochemistry is in the context of autism. So we've seen among children that ultimately become autistic that they have impaired detoxification is the mechanism for how they probably eventually, many of them become mercury toxic. So the question here would be, what's special about somebody that has asthma or arthritis? Do they have specific immune types? Do they have problems with detox? Is it something, I don't even know. But that would be, the mechanistic part would definitely be something to explore now. And if we understand that, it might open up all kinds of other diseases that would have a mercury component as well.
I mean, they wrote this down, like to get a foot in the door, I think. They wrote, they recommend you should not take them out. Okay, unless there's a medically necessary. So I guess the point would be, if anybody has any of these things, shouldn't we sort of, with an MD or somebody, get an order to remove them? I mean, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, those who say don't take it out unless there's a problem have to recognize what the problems are. So from our data, if you have asthma, that's a reason to take it out. If you have arthritis, that's a reason to take it out, and there may be other reasons. So just pretending, that, well, we don't know the reason, we don't know what you have, so don't take any out is foolish.
And I think I would add to that, the other important part is the beginning of our lecture, which is, what is a person's dose relative to safety limits? I think that's a really important consideration for a person. If you have X person that comes in and they're above one or more safety limits, that strikes me just as a lay person, that's a good medical reason. We have safety limits to protect the safety of people, and this person's above it. what's the point of the safety limit then if you don't take action?
Just a quick comment on what you just said regarding the FDA's announcement about don't use amalgams in high-risk populations. The second half of their statement was propaganda because it looked like it was written by the ADA, because it said, oh, by the way, don't ever remove amalgams because it's too dangerous to remove them. So it was kind of like ADA propaganda. No, don't ever remove them. Well, that's pure nonsense, because for one thing, they eventually get removed someday unless you die first. So I mean, they have a lifetime, so they will be removed. So if they're always dangerous to remove, they should never be put in the first place. Secondly, their 2009 amalgam rule was terrible. It was a total whitewash. Now that you recognize like 60% of the population is at high risk, why don't you go back, if you're sincere, FDA, go back and revise your rule, because you got it all wrong. And the word we got communicating with the FDA is, oh no, we're not going to revise the rule. So I think there's no sincerity in their attempt to protect the public and have a reasonable amalgam rule. And I see it largely as sort of a public relations stunt on their part.
I have a comment that I felt when I saw that, which was, I was a professor of OBGYN, it's actually GYN, OB at Hopkins, they like it the other way. And, you know, they said that you should consider not placing them in pregnant women or women that might become pregnant. It seemed to me that was, you know, everybody from 15 to 50 as a woman. And I mean, if you do that many, you might as well just make it universal. I mean, a woman might even say, she's 22 today, she's not going to have any babies. Next week, you know, it might change, and now she's got the amalgam. It applies to all, it should apply to all women of reproductive age, and that's most of the women.
Charlie Brown had me write a comment during the comment section of that, and I just want to share what I wrote there. Is I cited the Casapia study, and basically wrote that you have no way of knowing who the susceptible people really are, because when James Woods first the study showed there was no real difference in the general population between the amalgams and the composites, but then when they took out a subset of them that was pretty significant. I don't remember what the number, the percentage was, but it was with metallothionein SNPs. And those kids who had the metallothionein SNPs had significant impairment of cognitive function. So unless you're going to go and measure these esoteric SNPs on everybody, you don't know who the susceptible ones are just in the population without even going into the childbearing age and this and that. And therefore, you have no way of knowing, and then you just shouldn't be doing it. And then just put a pitch in for smart rule. Then you're not even in this, like, what groups are in and what groups are out.
How do you remove over 100 million people's teeth?
Hi, Dr. Kevin. We have a question for you. Hi.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. There's a question from the virtual audience. It's if a child doesn't grow more than their jaw size, really at 4 to 5 years old, then how are we doing the 28 plus age and getting ultimately too often a 34 to 42 millimeter width?
Sorry that the audio was not good. I need all that to work that.
Okay.
I don't know what to do. Maybe I need headphones or something. It's really.
You can't hear me.
Let me look for my earphones.
Okay.
Even if put it in the chat
Do you want to type it? Type it. Okay. Yes.
The audio is so bad. See what I can do here. Okay, can you repeat the question? I've got my headphones. I can't hear. I'm really sorry, I can't hear anything.
Can you hear me?
I'll look in the chat. Maybe somebody could write the question.
Can you write? Farrah, can you write it?
I can now. It's not real clear now. It's who that was.
We're gonna type it in for you.
Yeah, it's really troubled. It's not a 4 to 5-year-old, I think, and they were talking about molar width or.
Well, while we're doing that, if anybody has another question for the other speakers, we could do that while we're trying to get the question to Dr. Kevin.
Hi, I just have a kind of an off-the-wall question. I know that you guys, David and Mark, you did a lot of work with bears, and I was just wondering if you were able to retain any of that research and if it could be applicable to what you're doing now. And it was very good, by the way. I like that.
Bears is about vaccines, so it's applicable to some of the research we do, but it's not specific to dental analysis. So I'm not.
Well, we were doing a lot of cross-referencing at the time. I don't know if you remember or not during the committee hearings.
You're talking about like trying to link Bears reports to individuals?
Yeah, because we were cross-referencing the amalgam fillings into the vaccine program, and we were Boyd Haley was adding between the two in some of the studies that he was doing, because the mercury load was just absolutely out the roof even then. I was just wondering. I mean, it's
Simple answer is no. So we don't use Bears to do our other studies. There could be separate.
Now I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, that's the first time. So I'm typing in and what I thought when we had here. Can you hear me? Good? Yes. Okay. The question, as I read it, if the child doesn't grow more than their jaw size, plus age, is that like, and getting ultimately too often at 38 to 42 millimeters? Okay, so it's 24 millimeters plus their age, starting at 4. If they're not at least 28 millimeters by age 4, then they're already growth deficient. But it's not 28 plus their age, it's 24 plus their age. And really, we like them to be their full adult width by 8 or 9 years old, because that's what our ancestors were. So a 9-year-old, 24 plus 9, 33. You want to be at least 33, 34 millimeters by 9 or 10 years old. It's an index. It's not diagnostic. Like body mass index is, it doesn't diagnose obesity. It gives you relative adiposity or how much fat tissue you have. But Arnie Schwarzenegger had a BMI of 45 when he was in shape. He had not an ounce of fat on him. He wasn't obese. So that's an outlier. So this isn't, it's meant to be an index, like an index finger. It points to something, but it's not a diagnosis. If you have a kid that, 10 years old, 24 plus 10, 34, it points you in the right, that kid's going in the right direction, but he's not necessarily his full adult width yet. McNamara, orthodontist, University of Michigan, established this for 6-year molars at the mesiobuccal cusp at the gingival margin. By age 12, it should be between 37 and 40. That is, that validates this metric that I'm talking, that was established in 100 years ago by Dr. Bogue, B-O-G-U-E. I call it the Bogue Index. So there's other metrics that you have to do. You have to measure the sagittal length, is the jaw forward of upper and lower jaws. I'm sorry, it's not real quick cookie cutter. They're meant to be indices that point you towards something. Does that help? I mean, really, we have got to start seeing these kids in the primary dentition for retrognathia and transverse problems, even without crossbites. You don't need a crossbite to diagnose maxillary transverse deficiency. I hope I got that. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you guys. I really wish I could have.
Any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Farah, you have 2 more questions.
I see a question that says removable or fixed. You want me to answer that? I'm not sure if you heard me. There's a question about removable appliances or fixed appliances. And okay, it says, Farah said yes. Okay, there isn't like, oh yes, fixed or removable. It depends on the situation. Again, if a child, it depends on how old they are, what the nature of the problem is. But there's no such thing as, oh, I only use fixed appliances. I use removable. It doesn't work that way. What you have to do, say you've got a 4-year-old, and I say that on purpose, is uncooperative. If you can limit your practice to girls, you're going to do better because they tend to be more cooperative all their lives, but starting in early childhood. I will often use a fixed appliance. If I ask the parents, is your child a rule follower? And it takes them more than 3 seconds to answer. I already have my answer. I'm recommend fixed. But immediately they say, oh, yes, they follow rules. You can use removable appliances. I hope that helps. I hope that you will consider treating the primary dentition. There's another reason when you want to have fixed appliances. If you have vertical growth, if you have long face, adenoid face, you really want to do a fixed appliance with posterior, occlusal coverage, acrylic, to suppress vertical eruption. So there's 2 reasons when you want to do a fixed appliance and when you want to put occlusal coverage on it. And that is a poor compliance or suspected poor compliance and vertical growth sensitivity. If they're obstructed, their faces can get long. You want to stop the whole process. Jaw and put posterior occlusal coverage on a fixed appliance is a way to do it. That's just a concept. Doesn't tell you all the specifics. There's more to it than that I'm happy to individually, if you want to email me or call me if you've got a 4-year-old that you want to treat, I'll help you get started. That's all I can tell you at this point. Okay, somebody said, a follow-up to the first question. Wanted to clarify, if a jaw doesn't grow much past 4, it doesn't grow much in the transverse dimension. When you talk about growth, you have to talk about it in 3 planes of space. Transverse, width, length of sagittal, retrognathic mandibles, okay, they're back. Maxillas can be retrognathic, class 3, we all know that. And vertical, height. So to answer that question, it's like, what do you keep adding to age? You're asking the right questions, great questions. Nothing will be solved, I use this appliance all the time and this will fix everything. And it doesn't work that way. The whole concept is we have to get in earlier. Transverse deficiency, as I said in my talk, will never improve. Okay, you see a kid that's too narrow, even if they don't have a crossbite, at 3 years old, always going to be that way. Cannot self-correct, will not self-correct. Okay, it's going to get worse. So why don't you wait till they're 13? Because it can be a comorbidity with sleep and breathing and neurological problems. So it's medically indefensible to look at a 3-year-old, 4-year-old that's transverse deficient and say, okay, wait till they're older. It's like ophthalmology. If the kid is nearsighted at 3 or 4, would it be medically defensible for an ophthalmologist to say, save up your money, give him his first set of glasses when he's driving a car, let his vision get worse over time? Of course not, and it's a great analogy. It's medically defensible analogy.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Does anybody else have any other questions? There's one more.
I can't hear you. I heard, I'm sorry, the audio, and I think I've got things solved on this end. There's too much echo, and somebody was talking about Healthy Start, MyoBrace. You know what? Those are good training appliances to get a kid less orally defensive. Little kids should be orally defensive. And to help them overcome that before you can actually put in an expander, these things will prevent things from getting worse. MyoBrace, MyoMunchie, Healthy Start, Good Concept, Great Legs. There's lots of them out there. They do tend to help kids become less orally defensive, and they do tend to prevent things from getting worse, but they will not give you the transverse and sagittal development that you need. You need to do, myofunctional therapy is really important to be adjunctive, everything you do under the age of 6. And you need to get rigid appliances in there. Sorry, it's just the way it goes. Doing something like MyoBrace is better than nothing, but if you really want to get efficient and quick results that can help a kid sleep and breathe better, you have got to start doing arch development with rigid appliances, fixed or removable, depends on the case. If you do nothing but maxillary transverse deficiency correction, you don't know what to do, all right? If a kid's upper jaw is narrow, you do nothing else but help that jaw, use the Vogue index, 24 millimeters plus their age, at the mesiolingual cusp of the upper second primary molars, you are doing a wonderful thing for the head, because you are the maxilla is the key. You develop that maxilla optimally at the earliest possible age. The mandible, you can get into those nuances later. Develop the maxilla. It's been done for 100 years. Literature from medical and dental literature. You must develop that maxilla as early in life as possible. I'm reading questions here. I'm sorry if they're not in order. I'm just coming up and trying to, there's some great questions here. It really makes me feel good that I must have done a few things right in my talk, because you're asking great informed questions. Mandibular insufficiency, just by treating the maxilla. One last thing, mandibular insufficiency, what? Vertical, sagittal, or transverse? So it's not just one thing. You must answer questions in 3 dimensions. A retrognathic mandible is a form of insufficiency, but so is a narrow mandible, and so is a vertically growing mandible. So, okay, well, thanks. I mean, you're curious, and I'm grateful for that. I'm done. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Does anybody else have any questions? If not, we can all go to dinner. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.